So the FBI has decided to literally open an investigation into a journalist who wrote an unflattering piece about FBI Director Kash Patel. So the FBI is currently retaliating against a journalist for doing journalism. That's embarrassing for the FBI director. That's unconstitutional, but we'll see where this case goes. Because last month, the Atlantic's reporter, Sarah Fitzpatrick, published an article that we talked about in detail on this show. It had to do with the fact that, seems like Director Patel has some erratic behavior that should be concerning to anyone who wants to have an FBI run by someone who knows what they're doing and it doesn't have substance abuse issues. So, several officials apparently told Sarah Fitzpatrick that Patel's drinking has been a recurring source of concern across the government. They said that he is known to drink to the point of obvious intoxication, in many cases at the private club Ned's in Washington, D.C., while in the presence of White House and other administration staff. That literally, I know I said this the first time I covered the story, I have to say it again. That literally sounds like hell. Like I would do anything to avoid that situation. Like having drinks with a bunch of politicians, doesn't even have to be Trump administration officials, bunch of politicians in some DC bar, I'd rather slip my wrist. Like I'm just keeping it real. Okay, so Fitzpatrick also reported at the time that Patel is also known to drink to excess at the Poodle Room in Las Vegas, where he frequently spends parts of his weekends. I mean, I could probably get down with getting drunk at the Poodle Room, as long as it's not with a bunch of politicians, okay? But early in his tenure, meetings and briefings had to be rescheduled for later in the day as a result of his alcohol-fueled nights, and that's according to 6 current and former officials and others familiar with Patel's schedule. Okay, so look, needless to say, does not shed a positive light on FBI Director Kash Patel. And he could have done what most government officials do when something unflattering is published about them. Ignore it, don't draw attention to it, move on. Americans at this point, because we're constantly bombarded with the news cycle, have the attention span of goldfish, so people will move on and forget about it. But no, he didn't do that. He did the opposite. He decided, I'm gonna draw as much attention to this as possible by threatening to sue the Atlantic and investigating the reporter who published this piece about me. It's just so sad. It's so sad. So it's just amazing. So the FBI is apparently denying the investigation, telling MS Now the following: this is completely false. No such investigation like this exists, and the reporter you mentioned is not being investigated at all. Every time there's a publication of false claims by anonymous sources that gets called out, the media plays the victim via investigations that do not exist. Now, just to give you some more information, MS Now reported, let's go to graphic 4 here. Sources said the so-called insider threat investigation that is being carried out by the FBI is highly unusual because it did not stem from a disclosure of classified information and because it is focused on leaks to a reporter. Typically, leak investigations look into government officials who may have disclosed state secrets or classified documents. Journalists who receive and publish such information have typically only been involved as potential witnesses. So, the FBI is probably embarrassed and they're denying that there is an investigation taking place, despite the FBI's insistence that an investigation is taking place. It's pretty easy for one to get the impression that the FBI would retaliate, right? So the DOJ typically has a pretty high bar when it comes to summoning records from journalists, and usually they only pursue this as a last-ditch effort in serious circumstances of leaked classified intelligence. But in Trump's first term, if you guys can remember, the Justice Department surreptitiously procured documents from journalists with CNN, the Washington Post, and the New York Times regarding their coverage of the alleged Russian interference in the 2026 election, Russiagate, basically. Okay. And in response to this, in July of 2021, Biden's district attorney, Merrick Garland, adopted a policy that required that the department only subpoena or seek records of reporters engaged in normal news gathering when a member of the news media is the subject or target of an investigation and is suspected of committing an offense. However, let's go back to Trump. Trump's Attorney General, Pam Bondi, repealed it, okay? Repealed Garland's policy in April of 2025 within 3 months of taking office, and dramatically lowered the standards for prosecutors in seeking such records. Why would you do that if you didn't ever want to retaliate against reporters who are simply doing their jobs and potentially publishing things that are unflattering, not illegal, but unflattering? Bondi's revisions, however, recognize that demanding reporters' testimony and records through subpoenas and search warrants was a technique to be deployed as a last resort. But look, even with that caveat, the assaults on journalists from this administration have been happening and they continue. Like, we're not dumb, we see it, right? So in January, for instance, as The Atlantic reports, FBI agents executed a search warrant at the home of Washington Post reporter Hannah Natanson, seizing her phone and other devices as part of an investigation into a government contractor who was charged with unlawfully transmitting and retaining classified information. And if you think that the search that was done, the raid that was done on her home was like totally normal, it's not. It's actually incredibly unusual. Weeks earlier, Natanson had published an essay about how she had connected with more than 1,000 sources about the Trump administration's overhaul of the federal government. 2 federal judges have barred the seizure of Natanson's devices, and she would later win a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting. And then in March, the FBI began investigating the New York Times reporter Elizabeth Williamson after she wrote a report about Patel using bureau personnel to protect his girlfriend and ferry her around, the paper reported. I mean, so do I believe the FBI when they say they're not retaliating against The Atlantic? No, I don't believe the FBI. I don't trust our government. Anyone who does trust our government, I wanna know what drug you're taking to be as optimistic as you would need to be to trust this government, okay? On April 21st, a day after Patel filed a defamation suit against The Atlantic, a federal judge in the Southern District of Texas dismissed the suit. Dismissed the suit. So look, guys, Kash Patel is embarrassing. He's an embarrassing person. And he ended up getting an embarrassing profile written about him in The Atlantic. The only real solution here is don't draw attention to the embarrassing piece and do something about your embarrassing behavior, but he can't help it. He can't help it. So understand that all the money that goes toward the federal government is either squandered on nonsense, like the Pentagon, or pays for the salaries of these complete and utter embarrassments, these losers who humiliate the American people on a daily basis. Kash Patel, the guy who was part of the Epstein cover-up, even though he built a career drawing attention to the Epstein files, then he's in a position of power, won't do anything about it. Same with Dan Bongino. These guys are losers. And they think that if you retaliate against reporters and prevent reporting about how big of losers they really are, then the American people won't know how lame they really are. But we know, we all know. So just let it go. Don't violate freedom of the press. Let it go, move on. You're an embarrassment. But don't worry, Kash. The rest of this administration is also an embarrassment. So you've got some company.
Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.